Pandemonium broke out when the alien Queen suddenly collapsed, but only the human guard understood. My boots hit the floor of the grand corridor at exactly 600 hours, and the first thing I noticed was that the temperature was wrong, not wrong in the way a broken thermostat feels wrong, wrong in the way that a body knows before the mind does. A dry, heavy wrongness that sat against the skin like a pressed cloth. The Zith sovereignty kept their royal halls at precisely 22 degrees centigrade. It was protocol carved into the diplomatic briefing I had read 11 times on the 4-month transit from Earth. That morning it felt closer to 29, maybe 30. I made a note in the small paper notebook I kept in my breast pocket. No one else among the diplomatic staff used paper notebooks. The KTH used neural pins that recorded everything directly into their memory lattice. The Duravi stored observations in crystallized vapor pouches that dissolved into their bloodstream. My Zareth counterpart, a guard named Vethers, had once looked at my notebook the way a surgeon might look at someone using a rock to remove a splinter, with a kind of patient, horrified curiosity. I did not care. Paper did not crash, did not need charging, and could not be remotely wiped. I wrote, hall temperature elevated approx 78 degrees above standard. Day 94 of posting. My name is Aller Voss. I am a sergeant with the Earth Diplomatic Security Corps, and for the past 94 days I have been assigned as the human protective attaché to the court of Queen the Savari, the eternal sovereign ruler of the Zareth sovereignty and the most powerful single living being within 6 star systems. The posting had not been given to me as an honor. I want to be clear about that, because there is a version of this story where the humans are chosen because someone recognized something special in them, some latent quality that the galaxy decided to reward. That is not what happened. What happened was that the Galactic Compact needed to assign a human security representative to one of the major member courts, and the Zith court was considered the least desirable assignment available. The Zith were insectoid, ancient, and deeply uninterested in the opinions of species that had only recently discovered interstellar travel. They did not dislike humans the way the Keth disliked humans, with a loud performative contempt that at least acknowledged the effort. The Zith simply did not think about humans very much at all, so they got a human guard, and the human guard got me, and I arrived at the sovereign capital station with 2 duffel bags, a notebook, and a reading list I had assembled over the 8 months between assignment and departure. The reading list had 47 items on it. I finished all 47. Most of them were academic papers, the kind that existed in the dark corners of xenobiological archives, where download counters had single digits, papers on Zyreth metabolic cycles, papers on carapace composition, and the thermal properties of a freshly molted exoskeleton, a paper written by a Daravi researcher 40 years ago and apparently read by almost no one, on a condition called Kathvari, a heat cascade failure that could occur in Zyreth Queens during the vulnerable window following a major maul. I had read that paper 3 times. I had taken notes on it in my notebook, not because I thought it would ever matter, but because that is what I do. That is what humans do in my experience. We read the things no one else reads. We learn the things that seem useless, and we carry that knowledge around like extra weight that might one day stop being extra. Vuss was already at his post when I reached the outer corridor of the Queen's chamber wing. He was 8 ft tall, broad across the upper thorax with a carapace that had gone dark gold with age. He had 4 arms, 2 sets of compound eyes, and the absolute stillness of a creature that had been trained from birth to project invulnerability. He glanced at me with the set of eyes that faced sideways, the assessment eyes I had learned, and then looked forward again. Surgeon Voss, he said in the flat, compact standard translation that his vocalizer produced. You are 4 minutes early. I know, I said. He did not ask why. That was one of the things I had come to appreciate about Thurs. He never asked why I did the things I did. He simply noted them, filed them somewhere in that enormous, ancient mind, and continued being professionally unreadable. I took my post on the left side of the corridor entrance and did the thing I had done every morning for 94 days. I looked at everything. The Zith court was extraordinary to look at in the way that a storm system is extraordinary. Impressive, alien, and not remotely designed with you in mind. The walls were a deep amber kitten composite grown rather than built, curved in ways that looked organic because they were. The light came from bioluminescent panels that pulsed very slowly, almost like breathing. The floor was polished to a mirror finish, and in that mirror you could see the reflections of the dozens of Kurters who moved through the hall each day, Zareth nobles and servants and diplomatic staff from a dozen species, all of them moving in patterns I had spent 3 months trying to understand. I had learned a great deal about those patterns who moved near the Queen during the morning hours and who did not, which Kurters spoke to her directly and which ones communicated through layers of intermediaries, who brought her food, what the food looked like, how much she ate, and more importantly, how much she had been eating lately. The answer for the past 3 weeks was less, noticeably less. I had filed a report on it. I filed it through the standard compact diplomatic channel, addressed to both the human mission coordinator and the Zith administrative office. I was careful to phrase it in neutral terms, not a warning, an observation, a data point offered by someone who had been watching carefully and thought that someone with more authority should know. The report had been acknowledged with an automated receipt and never mentioned again. That was on day 73. Today was day 94 and the hall was 7 degrees too warm. I wrote that down and put the notebook away. The morning ceremony began at 700, as it always did. The great doors at the far end of the corridor opened in sequence, each pair heavier and more elaborate than the last, and the Queen's procession began. I had watched this procession 93 times. I knew exactly how it moved, exactly how long it took, exactly what it sounded like. The deep harmonic hum that the Zeroth nobles produced in unison when the Queen entered, a sound that sat at a frequency just below hearing and made the floor vibrate faintly under your boots. I knew the Queen's gait. I had studied it the way a person might study a piece of music they were trying to learn, not consciously, not deliberately at first, but through the sheer accumulation of repeated observation, until the pattern lived somewhere in the body rather than the mind. I knew how she held her forward limbs during the walk, slightly elevated, fingers fanned. I knew how her secondary limbs moved, the rhythm of them, 3 beats on the Left for every two on the right, I knew. The exact way her head turned when she acknowledged a courtier she considered worthy of acknowledgement. I noticed on day 94 that her secondary limbs were moving differently. It was subtle. If I had not been watching that specific thing on that specific morning, I would not have seen it. The rhythm was off by less than half a beat. The left limbs were hitting the floor a fraction of a second later than usual. Not a limp, not a stumble, something more internal than that, a hesitation that came from inside the body rather than outside it. I took a slow breath. I thought of the paper. The Davy researchers' paper, written 40 years ago, downloaded 4 times, according to the archive counter, and read in full by at least one human sergeant with nothing but time in a notebook on a 4-month transit. The paper had described the early signs of Kethvari in very specific terms. One of those terms was rhythmic desynchronization in the locomotive limbs. Another was elevated ambient temperature preference, where the affected individuals sought or produced heat as the metabolic cascade began to build. Another was reduced feeding in the 14 to 21 days preceding acute onset. 3 weeks of reduced feeding, a hall that was 7 degrees too warm, and a queen whose secondary limbs were half a beat behind. I did not panic. I did not move. I stood at my post and I watched the procession complete and the queen take her seat on the ceremonial platform at the head of the hall, and I kept my breathing even and my face neutral and my hands loose at my sides, and I thought I need to stay very close to her today. I thought, if I am right, then everything in this hall is going to change very quickly. I thought, if I am wrong, I will have embarrassed the entire human diplomatic mission and they will find someone else for this posting, and I will spend the rest of my career cataloging supply requests on a station somewhere near the edge of nothing. I thought, I am not wrong. There was a locust scribe on the right side of the hall, young by Zith standards, with a pale carapace that had not yet darkened to the amber gold of the older Kurters. His name was Sevek, and he was the only member of the Zareth court who had ever voluntarily started conversation with me. He had done it on my 3rd day, sidling up during a between ceremony break to ask in careful, compact standard whether it was true that humans slept with their eyes closed. I had told him it was true. He had found this remarkable. We had talked in the weeks since about small things, mostly the food on the station, the differences between Earth seasons, and the climate cycles of the sovereignties home world, the way humans experience time versus the way Zyra experienced it. He was curious in the genuine way, the way that does not have an agenda behind it, and I had found myself looking forward to those small conversations in a way I had not expected. I caught Sake's eye across the hall that morning. He gave the small antenna flicker that I had come to understand meant acknowledgement without speech. I gave him a slow nod, then I turned my attention back to the queen and I watched and I waited. And somewhere in the back of my mind, 47 papers and 94 mornings and 3 weeks of careful, unnoticed observation were arranging themselves into a shape I was not ready to name yet, but I was close. I was very close. The Grand Assembly of the Galactic Compact was not the kind of event that allowed for private concern. I understood that before it even began. The assembly convened 4 times per galactic year, and the hosting rotated among the major member states. This Cycle, it was the Zith sovereignties. Turn to host, which meant queen. Thesavari would sit at the head of the ceremonial table for the full duration. Approximately 6 hours of formal address, treaty review, and the elaborate performance of diplomatic unity that held the compact together. The way shared fiction holds any community together, you believe it enough in it, becomes real. 31 species were represented, 31 different forms of biology, communication, and social structure, all pressed into the same enormous hall and expected to perform. Agreement for an audience that included broadcast feeds reaching 11-star system. The hall itself was the largest enclosed space on the station, a vaulted chamber grown from the same amber kitten as the rest of the court, but scaled up to a size that made individuals feel small regardless of their species. The bioluminescent lighting had been turned up for the occasion. The pulse slowed to something more stately, and the air carried a faint ceremonial scent that the Zith used to signal formal occasion. Something dry and ancient, like old wood left in the sun. I was positioned at the Queen's left rear quarter, which was where the human security detail was expected to stand far enough back to be unobtrusive, close enough to be visible. A symbol more than a function. That was how the Zith thought of me. I was aware of it, and I had decided somewhere around day 40 that being thought of as a symbol was actually useful. Symbols get underestimated. Symbols get ignored. Symbols can watch very carefully without anyone watching back. V. Thurs was at the Queen's right forward quarter, which was the actual protective position. He was the real guard. I was the diplomatic decoration. That was the understanding. And on 93 of the previous 94 days, it had been accurate. The assembly opened with the standard recitation. Compact charter read aloud by a representative from each species in their native language, translated simultaneously into compact standard through the hall's acoustic system. It lasted 47 minutes. I had timed it before. I used those 47 minutes the same way I used every formal ceremony. Watching the Queen sat still. That was the first thing I clocked, because stillness in Zyra royalty was not the same as stillness in humans. Human stillness is the absence of motion. Zerath royal stillness is a performed state, held deliberately, projected, consciously, maintained as an expression of authority. The Queen was still in the performed sense for the first 40 minutes of the recitation. Then around the 40-minute mark, something changed. It was in the chromatophores first. The Zyreth had bioluminescent cells distributed across the carapace, not bright enough to glow in full light, but visible as a subtle shifting of color, the way oil on water shifts depending on the angle you see it from. The Queen's chromatophores were usually a deep steady gold, the color of authority, the color of age. I had watched them for 94 days, and they had been that deep, steady gold for every moment of every formal occasion without variation. At the 40-minute mark, the gold began to go pale at the edges. Not dramatically, not in a way that would catch anyone's eye who wasn't looking for exactly that, just a slow creeping reduction in the richness of the color, moving inward from the edges of the carapace plates the way tide water retreats. I felt my pulse go up. Paper, the Davi researchers' paper, the one with 4 downloads, had described this chromatic recession beginning at carapace margins, an early indicator of Thermal dysregulation as the body redirected resources toward core function and pulled back from peripheral display. The recitation ended. The formal addresses began. 3 species gave opening remarks in the first hour, and during that hour I watched the queen's color continue to fade and watched her limb rhythm continue to drift, and I did the mathematics that I had been doing since morning. 14 to 21 days of reduced feeding. Check. Elevated temperature preference in personal quarters. Check. I had noticed the temperature differential in the outer corridor, which meant it had been even warmer in the inner chambers where the queen slept. Rhythmic desynchronization is secondary limbs. Check. Now chromatic recession at carapace margins. The paper had been very specific about what came after chromatic recession. I began to move very slowly forward and to the left, not a dramatic shift, just a gradual patient adjustment of position that I had been thinking about since I walked into the hall that morning. I was moving from my symbolic position to a position that was actually useful, closer to the queen, closer to the space between her and the floor. V. Thurs noticed. He tracked me with his sideways eyes without turning his head. I gave him the small open palm gesture that we had developed over 94 days as a signal, meaning I see something, not a threat. Wait. He held his position. He trusted me enough for that much, which was more than I had expected when I arrived in, more than I had ever taken for granted. The Keth ambassador was speaking at the table. The Ke were tall and hard-shouldered, and spoke in a register that translated as perpetual mild irritation regardless of what they were actually saying. Something about resource allocation in the outer systems, a recurring dispute that never got resolved and never quite escalated to actual conflict. I was not listening to the words. I was watching the queen, her mandibles, the outer ones, the large ceremonial pair that she held open during formal address, were beginning to curve inward. The paper had described this as the mandibular curl reflex, an involuntary pain suppression response triggered by the early stages of acute Kethver onset, the Zerath body's attempt to suppress and internalize discomfort before it became visible to others, a queen's instinct. Do not show weakness, do not give the court a reason to question the throne. She was in pain. She had been in pain. Probably for several hours. She was holding it with everything she had, performing steadiness for 31 species and an 11-system broadcast, and her body was losing the argument. I was now 5T behind her and slightly to the left. I looked at Sevek. He was at his scrib's position, along the sidewall, stylus in hand, recording the proceedings in the elaborate Zerath pictographic script that no non-Zerath had ever fully learned to read. He was looking at the queen. His antennae were very still, which in Zerath body language meant something had alarmed him. He felt it too. He just did not know what it was. I caught his eye. I held up 2 fingers, then pointed at the floor between myself and the queen. In our weeks of small conversations, we had never developed a formal signal system, but Sevek was intelligent and quick, and I trusted that he would understand, be ready to come to me and come fast. His antenna flickered once. He understood. The Ke ambassador was still speaking. The hall was full of the careful attention of 31 species, and the queen was sitting at the head of it all, holding herself together through what I now recognized as an extraordinary act of will against A body that was beginning to fail in a very specific and very serious way. Kevi, in the acute phase, was not slow. The Davi researcher had been very clear on that point. The cascade, once it tipped past a certain threshold, accelerated rapidly. The thermal regulation system failed, the metabolic rate spiked, circulatory pathways to the extremities narrowed. A queen caught in the acute phase without intervention could lose consciousness within minutes and sustain serious physiological damage within hour. The intervention, as described in the paper, was specific, immediate. External cooling applied to the primary thermal vents, the spiracles along the neck and upper thorax, electrolyte solution administered as close to the mouth parts as possible, and the secondary breathing spiracles, which would begin to close as the body tried to conserve core temperature, needed to be held open manually to prevent respiratory compromise, manually as in with hands. I had thought about that part of the paper many times since reading it. I had thought about it in the abstract, the way you think about emergency procedures you hope you will never need, and now I was standing 5 feet from the most powerful sovereign in 6 star systems, and the theory was about to stop being abstract. The queen's left forward limb moved, not in the normal way, not the controlled, deliberate movement of a being performing authority. It moved sideways, slightly in the way that a limb moves when the body beneath it is making a decision it has not announced yet. Preparatory motion, unconsciousness, the body beginning to shift weight before the mind has acknowledged that it needs to. She was going to fall. I knew it the way you know the punchline of a joke, one beat before it arrives. The knowledge arrived whole, complete and certain, and by the time my mind had finished registering it, my body was already moving. I covered the 5 FT in 2 steps. The queen went down. It was not a slow fall, it was sudden and total, a great structure simply giving way. All that height and weight and authority dropping straight toward the polished floor with a sound like the first beat of thunder. And I was there not to catch her. She was too large for that. No human could have caught her, but to intercept the angle of the fall, to get my shoulder under the forward part of her thorax, to absorb enough of the impact that her head and the delicate upper carapace did not strike the floor at full force. Impact was enormous. I felt it through every joint in my body. I went down to one knee and stayed there, both arms braced under the queen's forward thorax, her head cradled against my left side, her weight pressing down like a collapsed ceiling. Then the hall exploded. Assassination. Someone screamed in K. I recognized the word from my briefings because it was one of the first words taught in cross-species diplomatic language training, the word most likely to start a war. The Zareth royal guards came off their positions like a wave, 6 of them, 8 of them, weapon bins materializing from storage cells along the carapace, because Zith guard armor incorporated the weapons rather than carrying them separately. Fact I had read about and thought about in the abstract and was now experiencing. At very close range, they were pointing those weapons at everything, at the exits, at the other species, at me. The Davi ambassador overturned his chair, getting away from the table. The Pelhari delegation, small, fast-moving, quadrupedal, had already cleared the room through the side corridor. The KE ambassador was standing on his chair, which was both undignified and oddly practical. The Morvith contingent, who had 4 arms and used all of them for gesturing when alarmed, were producing a noise somewhere between a siren and a choir human bioweapon, the Keth. Ambassador announced loudly to no one in particular and everyone simultaneously. This is a deliberate act, this is sake. My voice came out louder than I intended, powered by the need to be heard over 30 species of panic, sake. Now come to me now, he was already moving, of all the beings in that hall. He was the only one moving toward the Queen rather than away from her. Crossing the floor at the loping 3-point gate of a Zirath, moving with real urgency, 2 of the royal guards moved to intercept him. And then a 3rd guard moved to intercept me, towering over me with a weapon deployed, close enough that I could smell the heat of the charging cell. I did not move my arms from under the Queen. I looked up at the guard and I said in compact, standard and the steadiest voice I could find, I know what is happening to her. Move away from me or she will die. The guard did not move. The Queen's spiracles, the secondary ones, the small segmented openings along the base of her neck, were already beginning to close. I could see it happening. I could feel the change in the air against my face, the slight reduction in the warm exhale that had been coming from them. Her chromatophores were pale now, almost white at the margins, and her limbs were trembling with a fine continuous vibration that was not struggle and not pain and was much worse than either. It was systemic failure beginning to run. Sevik, I said, not moving my eyes from the guard. Do not stop. Come directly to me. C pushed past one of the guards with a forcefulness I had never seen from him before, and the guard, perhaps too confused by the situation to respond to something so unexpected, did not stop him. He dropped to his knees beside me, antennae forward and flat, which was the Zyra expression of controlled fear. Tell me what to do, he said. I told him later I would think about the next 12 minutes as a kind of controlled chaos, a space where everything around us was noise and threat and barely contained catastrophe, and the 2 of us were in the center of it, doing something very small and very specific and very critical. At the time I did not think about it at all. I simply moved through it one step at a time, the way the paper had laid it out 40 years ago in a research archive that almost no one had read. The water vessels on the ceremonial table, I said, the tall ones, not the short ones. Bring me 3 and tell me if any of the mineral salts used in the opening rites are still accessible. She looked at me. The sacred mineral offering, I need it for her breathing and her fluid balance. It is more sacred right now as medicine than as ceremony. Go, he went. One of the royal guards stepped toward me again, weapon raised, and this time with the Queen's head against my side and her trembling weight in my arms, and the terrible sound of her spiracles narrowing, audible in the sudden pocket of near silence that had opened around us. I said something I had memorized from a footnote in a diplomatic protocol appendix that I had read on day 11 of the transit, mostly out of compulsive thoroughness, not because I thought it would ever mean anything. I said it in formal Xi, not compact standard. I said it in the archaic register, the one used for legal declarations of knowledge. Voris Kethel Savari. I claim the right of the known under compact Article 7. I possess knowledge this court does not. The guard stopped. The weapon did not lower, but the guard stopped, and from somewhere behind me in the direction of the doors. I heard the Keth ambassador's voice cut off mid-accusation, as if someone had pressed a button, and in the silence that followed, the only sounds were the trembling of the Queen's limbs, and my own breathing, and Sake's fast footsteps returning across the polished floor. The entire hall was looking at me, not at the fallen Queen, not at each other, at me, a human kneeling on the floor of the most powerful court in 6 star systems, holding a queen that weighed 3 times what I did, speaking a legal phrase from an archaic register in a language that humans were not supposed to know, in the middle of a room that had just come apart at every seam. I did not look back at them. I turned to Sevik, took the first water vessel from his hands and began to work. Her primary thermal vents are at the base of the neck plates. I said, pour the water here slowly, all of it, not on the carapace, through the vent gaps. She needs direct cooling to the tissue beneath. She poured. I reached up with my right hand, keeping my left arm braced under the Queen's thorax, and found the first of the secondary spiracles by touch. I had read their anatomical location in 2 separate papers, and now I was learning them with my fingers, which is a different kind of knowledge entirely. The spiracle was nearly closed. I used 2 fingers and the careful pressure of someone who had read about this and thought about this, and now had no choice but to trust that thinking, and I held it open. The Queen exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale, and in it I heard something that might have been relief, or might have been just the sound of a respiratory system, given the space it needed to function. I do not know. I am not, sir. I cannot read their sounds the way I read their body language, but the trembling in her limbs slowed slightly, just enough to tell me I was not wrong. The mineral salts, I said, mix a small portion into the second water vessel. Not much, of fingertip measure only. See, did it, his movements careful and precise despite the chaos surrounding us. Now bring it close to her mouth. Parts she may not be able to drink, but proximity may trigger a passive absorption response through the palps. He did not question me. He simply did it, and behind us, around us, in the shattered hall of the Galactic Compact, 30 species watched in silence while 1 human and 1 locust Ziarth scribe worked to save a queen. The guard still had not lowered the weapon, but no one had fired it, and the Queen's chromatophores at the very margins, the outermost edges where the color had gone, first began, so slowly I was not certain I was seeing it, to cycle back toward gold. The weight was the hardest part, not the chaos of the collapse, not the 12 minutes on the floor, not the weight of the Queen's body against my arms, or the guard's weapon hovering in my peripheral vision the entire time. Those things had adrenaline in them. Adrenaline is a kind of company. It keeps the mind sharp and the hands steady, and it gives you something to push against. The weight had none of that. The weight was just a room, a small clean room with amber walls and no windows, and a single bioluminescent panel that pulsed slowly overhead, and nothing to push against except the silence. I had been placed in the holding room approximately 40 minutes after the Queen was moved to the Royal Medical Wing. 2 guards had escorted me, not unkindly, with a formality that suggested I was neither being arrested nor being celebrated, simply being managed until someone with the authority to make a decision could make one. Zareth official, not thus someone from the administrative side of the court, had told me in careful compact standard that I was to remain in the room until I was called for. He had not told me what I was being called for. I sat on the floor because there was no furniture. The Zith did not use furniture in the human sense, and the holding room reflected that, a space designed for the Zith which could rest standing or in a low crouch without any surface assistance. I sat cross-legged and I put my notebook on my knee and I wrote down everything I remembered from the past 6 hours, not because anyone would necessarily ever want to read it, because the act of writing had always helped me think, and I needed to think clearly, and the walls were pressing in a little despite being entirely stationary. The thing about being human in a space like this is that you are aware of it all the time, not anxiously aware, not resentfully aware, just aware, the way you are aware of the temperature of a room or the sound of a ventilation system. You are small in the wrong way, shaped wrong, breathing air that has been conditioned for someone else's lungs, sitting on a floor that was not designed with your joints in mind. You are a guest everywhere you go, and guests do not have the comfort of the familiar. I had gotten used to that. Somewhere around day 30, I had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound you hear constantly, but in the quiet of the holding room, with nothing to observe and nothing to do and no certainty about what came next. It came back, the simple fact of being human and being here and not knowing whether what I had done would be understood as the thing it actually was. There was a draft near the base of the wall. I noticed it because the bioluminescent panel above me shifted very slightly with the chain in air pressure. I watched the panel for a while. Its rhythm was familiar to me by now, the way the rhythm of any repeated thing becomes familiar if you pay attention. I had watched hundreds of them over 94 days. They all pulsed at slightly different rates, and I had a theory, unverified, unpublishable, entirely a product of too much observation and too little conversation, that the pulse rates were not arbitrary, that they tracked something biological in the Zyra who had grown them, the way the rhythm of a beehive tracks the health of the queen at its center. I wrote that down too. I had nowhere else to put it. After what I estimated was about 2 hours, the door opened, not the main door, a smaller access panel in the side wall that I had noted on the way in, but had not thought about since. Came through it in a low, hurried crouch, glancing back over his shoulder, and then straightened when he saw me and did something I had not seen him do before. He let his antenna fall completely forward, tips almost touching the floor. It was a gesture I did not have a clear translation for, something between relief and acknowledgement, something that sat in a register more personal than formal. You should not be here, I said. I know, he said. I will be brief. He pulled a folded document from a storage cell in his carapace. Zyreth did not have pockets, but they had small, smooth depressions along lower thorax that served the same purpose and held it out. To me, it was printed on the fine, translucent material the court used for official documents. I could not read the Zareth pictographic script, but I recognized the royal seal at the top. The royal physicians have completed their assessment. She said they have confirmed your diagnosis, all of it. The Kethvari cascade, the progression stages, the intervention protocol. They are presenting their confirmation to the Court Administrative Counsel within the hour. I was quiet for a moment. How is she? I asked, recovering the thermal cascade was intercepted before the secondary circulatory pathways narrowed completely. He paused. There would have been serious damage, possibly permanent. The physician's report states this clearly. I looked at the document in his hand. I could not read it, but I took it anyway, folded it carefully, and put it in my notebook. The counsel is in an unpleasant position. C continued. The KE ambassador has formally registered an accusation of deliberate destabilization by the human mission. He submitted it within 20 minutes of the collapse. Of course he did. There are factions within the court itself that are also unhappy. C. Antony moved in a way had learned to associate with delicacy, careful navigation of a difficult truth. Not all of them believe that what you did was appropriate. There are those who feel that an outsider should not have touched the Queen regardless of the outcome. I had known this was coming. It had been at the back of my mind during the entire 12 minutes on the floor. The Zith were not like humans in their relationship to physical contact, especially contact between beings of vastly different social standing. The Queen was not merely powerful in the political sense. She was sacred in a way that had legal dimensions. There were protocols about who could approach her, touch her, address her directly. I had violated several of them simultaneously and quite publicly in front of 31 species and an 11 system broadcast. No, I said, you saved her life's sake. Said, and his voice had something in it that was harder than his usual register. A certainty, a flatness that was not coldness but was the opposite of hedging. Whatever they say in the council room, that is the true thing. You saved her life. I looked at him. He was young as Zareth went, and young things in any species carry a particular quality when they are certain about something, a kind of brightness in the certainty, unweathered by the experience of having been certain before and been wrong. I believed him, but I also knew that true things and decided things were not always the same thing, and the council would be dealing in the currency of the decided. Thank you for coming. I said, you should go back before you attract attention. He held still for one more second, antennae still forward. Then he straightened, turned, and slipped back through the access panel. And I was alone again with the pulsing panel and the draft in my notebook. I turned to a new page and wrote, Sec. Confirmed physician verification, key. Accusation on record, court factions divided, and then I stopped and looked at what I had written and thought about the next 12 hours, which would determine the next 12 years of what humanity was. In this part of the galaxy, I am not a diplomat. I want to be clear about that. I am a security professional with an academic reading habit and a tendency to pay close attention to things that other people find boring. I do not have the training for what was happening around me on the political and diplomatic level. I had gotten through 94 days on this posting by staying in my lane, doing my job, and reading on my days off. But you spend enough time in a place and you learn the shape of it. You spend enough mornings watching who moves how and which curators avoid which rooms and how the light changes when something is being decided that has not been announced yet. You learn the grammar of a place without meaning to. And by day 94, I had enough of the court's grammar to know that what happened in the next several hours would not simply be about me, it would be about what the court decided humans were, whether we were the species that had demonstrated something valuable or the species that had committed an unacceptable presumption. I thought about the reading list, 47 papers, most of them long, dense, poorly formatted, translated from languages that did not have human equivalents for some of their most important concepts. I thought about the 8 months on the transit ship, the small reading light I used in the bunk so I would not wake my transit companions, the notes I took and margins of the printed copies and then transcribed into the notebook. I thought about how none of that had felt like preparation. It had felt like the thing you did when you were going somewhere that mattered and you wanted to not embarrass yourself. You learned what you could. You showed up knowing as much as a person could know without having actually been there. We were new. That was the single most important fact about humanity in the galactic context, and it shaped everything. We had not had centuries to build relationships and reputations and the accumulated social capital that comes from simply being present in a community for a long time. We had arrived recently, and we had arrived with good intentions and genuine curiosity and absolutely no status whatsoever, and the only thing we had brought with us that was ours and no one else's was the willingness to work, the willingness to study a place before you arrived, the willingness to read the 4-download paper, the willingness to notice the temperature of a hall and write it in a notebook and connect it to something you had learned months earlier, and file report that no one read, and then on the morning it mattered, be in the right position because you had spent 94 mornings building toward it without knowing that was what you were doing. I was still sitting with those thoughts when the main door opened. It was not a guard this time, it was a senior court official. I recognized the marking pattern on the carapace from the administrative briefing I had received on day one, the deep brown chevrons that indicated a senior position in the Queen's household administration. Behind the official were 2 royal guards, but they were standing at rest, not at alert. That was a difference I had learned to read. Sergeant Voss, the official, said, "You are summoned." I stood up. I put my notebook in my breast pocket. I straightened my uniform jacket and checked that the collar was even. "Summoned by whom?" I asked the official. Paused for just a fraction of a second. A zith pause which was smaller than a human pause but no less meaningful. "By the Queen," the official said. I followed the official out of the holding room and into the corridor, and I kept my hands loose at my sides and my breathing even. And I did not let myself think too far ahead, one step then the next. That was all there was. In the council chamber, off the main corridor, I could hear voices as we passed. The KET ambassadors translated register loud and insistent, and the flatter tones of the Zith Administrative Council responding. The accusation was being heard, the case was being made, and somewhere on the other side of all of it, the Royal Medical Wing was doing its work, and the Queen was either improving or she was not, and the outcome of everything that followed would hinge on a fact that was already decided and just had not been announced. I had done what I knew how to do. I had brought everything I had to a moment that needed it. Now I followed the official down the corridor toward whatever came next, and I kept my chin level and my boots quiet on the polished floor, and I waited to find out whether knowing the right thing at the right Time was going to be enough. The doors at the end of the corridor were the tall ones, the formal ones, the ones that were only opened for specific occasions. They opened. The medical wing of the Zith Royal Court was not designed for visitors. I understood this the moment we entered. Everything in the space was oriented toward function, toward the work being done and the being it was being done for. The room was cool, about 15 degrees, noticeably cooler than the rest of the station, and that was deliberate. I had read about Zareth Postcrises recovery in one of the papers on my list, a clinical document focused on thermal restoration after acute metabolic events. Controlled cooling following a heat cascade was critical. The body needed to be brought back to baseline slowly externally from the outside in. Somebody had read the same research, or they had arrived at it independently. Either way, the room was the right temperature. The senior official stopped at the doorway and did not enter, which told me the summons was specifically for me. I walked into the room alone. She was not lying down. I had not expected her to be. Zizrath did not rest horizontally the way humans did, and a queen would not perform vulnerability for anyone observing. She was in a supported resting position, upper body elevated, all 6 limbs in a loosely arranged posture that I recognized from my reading as Zyra, equivalent of a careful stillness. She was still wearing the ceremonial carapace layering from the assembly, or most of it, the pieces around the neck and upper thorax had been removed, I assumed by the medical staff for access. And without them the queen looked different, more present somehow, less armored against the world. Her chromatophores were gold, not the pale gold of the assembly's middle hours, not the white-edged near nothing of the moment before she fell. Real gold, deep and warm and steady. It was the most reassuring thing I had seen since I walked into the corridor that morning and felt the temperature was wrong. There were 2 royal physicians present, standing at the far side of the room, with the practiced neutrality of professionals near a patient. They did not acknowledge my entry. V. Thurs was at the door behind me. I had not heard him arrive, but I was not surprised he was there, and against the side wall, a little behind the queen's right, was the court senior herald who would record whatever was said here in the formal chronicle. That meant this was an official meeting, not a private recovery room conversation. Whatever happened here was going on the record. I stopped at what I judged to be the appropriate distance, close enough to be addressed without requiring raised voices, far enough to observe the formality that the herald's presence demanded. And I stood with my hands at my sides, and I waited. Surgeon Vos, the queen said, her voice unfiltered by the translation systems of the formal hall, was something I had never actually experienced before. The formal ceremonies always ran through acoustic processing that smoothed and leveled the output into compact standard, but here in the medical wing, with only the small translation pendant I carried doing the conversion, her actual voice came through underneath the translation, a deep harmonic layering of sound, multiple registers at once. The way a chord is more than the sum of its notes. It was extraordinary. I kept my expression even. My queen, I said it was the correct formal address. I had looked it up. She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet I became aware of the physicians watching me, of the herald stylus moving in small preparatory Strokes of ethers behind me a solid presence at the door I became aware of. My own heartbeat, which was faster than I would have preferred. You were asked to explain, the Queen said in the council chamber earlier. My administrative council asked the senior human mission representative to explain your actions. They were told that the actions were irregular and would be reviewed. Yes, I said, I'm asking you to explain them to me. I had thought about how to answer this in the holding room. I had written some of it in the notebook, but written preparation and spoken reality are different things. And standing in front of someone you have spent 94 days at a careful, respectful distance from, someone who had just come back from the edge of something irreversible changed what you thought you were going to say. I told her the truth. I told her about the reading list, about the 47 papers in the transit and the small reading light, about the Davari researcher who had written a careful, important paper 40 years ago that almost no one had read. I told her about day 3 of my posting. The first morning I stood at my post and decided that the most useful thing I could do was learn, not the diplomatic protocols, not the social hierarchies. Those were in all the briefing documents that everyone read. I mean, learn the temperature of the halls and the Queen's feeding schedule and the rhythm of her secondary limbs and the color of her chromatophores in every kind of light. I told her about the report I filed on day 73. I told her about the temperature. The outer corridor that morning, 7 degrees above standard. I told her about the moment I knew, not guessed, not feared, but knew that she was going to fall. She listened without moving. The physicians were very still. The Herald stylus moved constantly. You noticed my feeding reduction, the Queen said, when I finished. Yes, 3 weeks ago, 22 days ago. I noted the exact date. A pause, and you filed an observation report through the standard diplomatic channel. I received an automated acknowledgement. It was not forwarded to the royal physicians. No, I said. Another pause, this one longer. The chromatophores along the Queen's neck made a small, slow shift, not a color change exactly, more like a deepening. The way a color looks different when light changes behind it. Why? She asked. Why did you study these things? You were not required to. Your posting did not demand it. The diplomatic mission would have been satisfied with your presence alone. I had thought about how to answer this too. I had thought about whether to give her the version that sounded good, the version about duty and responsibility and the honor of representing humanity. That version was not untrue, but it was not the whole truth either, because we are new. I said, humanity in the compact, we are very new, and we have no history here, and no one owes us anything. We did not arrive with relationships or alliances or the kind of trust that takes centuries to build. We arrived with ourselves, and when you arrive somewhere new with nothing to recommend you except yourself, the only thing you can do is be worth knowing. I paused. The room was very quiet. I was afraid. I continued. Not afraid of this court, not afraid of the assignment, afraid of being useless, of being here for 94 days and leaving, having contributed nothing that the galaxy did not already have without me. That fear is what made me read. It is what made me pay attention. I did not study your Queen's physiology to save her life. I did not know I would ever need to. I studied it because it was there, and I was here, and I could not stand the idea of being somewhere Remarkable and understanding none of it. The Queen looked at me, her forward compound eyes and her lateral eyes in. Her small upper sensory eyes all oriented toward me at once, and for a moment I had the dizzying experience of being the total focus of an attention that was structurally different from human attention, not a single gaze, but something more like being examined from every angle simultaneously. You are afraid of ignorance, she said. Yes, as a species, I thought about that. Individually and as a species, yes, we are perhaps unusually uncomfortable with not knowing things. It drives us in directions that are not always practical. It drove you to a 40-year-old paper that no one read. Yes, she was quiet again. I waited because the alternative was filling a silence I had no right to fill. The Cath ambassador, the Queen said, has formally registered a grievance against the human diplomatic mission. He has accused you specifically of causing this incident by some means he has not been able to specify, and he has called for the removal of the human security detail from all Zeroth court functions. I said nothing. The court administrative council, she continued, has received the royal physician's report confirming your diagnosis and the necessity of your intervention. The council is divided on how to interpret the relationship between these two facts. I understand, and I said some among them believe that a correct diagnosis does not justify an unauthorized approach to the sovereign. They are correct technically. You violated several protocols. I know thus. The Queen's voice carried in the direction of the door without her head turning, a directional vocal projection that the Zerath were capable of in ways humans were not. Your assessment, V. Thur's voice came from behind me, measured and deliberate. Sergeant Voss gave me a warning signal before repositioning. She used the established protocol signal. Her movement was controlled and purposeful. She did not act erratically. When she invoked the right of the known, she did so in the formal archaic register without error or pause. I have served this court for 41 years. I have never heard a non-Zyra use the archaic register correctly. I did not lower my weapon. I should note that for the record, but I did not order her to stop. The herald stylus moved. Where did you learn the formal archaic register? The Queen asked me. Diplomatic Protocol. Appendix Secondary Reference Volume. Footnote annotation 14 Day 11 of my transit. Something happened then that I had never seen before and was not certain I was correctly interpreting. The Queen's chromatophores shifted across her entire carapace simultaneously. Wave of deeper gold that moved from the neck outward toward the edges. Reverse of the recession I had watched all morning in the hall. It lasted only a second, then it settled back to the steady, regular, warm gold. I did not know what it meant. I wrote it in my notebook. Later, from memory, I have a theory still unverified. There will be a formal determination by the administrative council. The Queen said the process will take 3 to 5 days. During this time you will remain on the station. You will not be restricted to the holding room. You may return to your quarters. Thank you. I said the K accusation will be addressed through the standard compact dispute mechanism. The human mission coordinator will be involved in that process. She paused. Separately, the royal physicians wish to speak with you. They have several questions about the Davi researcher's paper. I felt something shift in my chest that I did not entirely have a name for. something that was close to relief but had a quality of vindication in it that I did not entirely trust, because vindication can make you careless. I will make myself available. I said, there is one more thing. The Queen said. I waited. You said you were afraid of being useless, of leaving without having contributed anything the galaxy did not already have. The chromatophores made a small, slow movement, subtle at the edges only. The galaxy had the Davi researchers' paper for 40 years. It had the information. It did not have anyone who had read it and was standing in the right place at the right time, prepared to use it. She let that sit for a moment. You contributed yourself, she said. That is what you said. I am telling you that the contribution was sufficient. I stood in the cool room and I kept my hands at my sides and I breathed evenly, and I did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would have improved on the silence. You are dismissed, Sergeant. Thus, my senior herald will notify you when the council determination is ready. I gave the 0th formal acknowledgement, a specific positioning of the forward hand, palm slightly outward, that I had memorized from a social protocol document on day 6 of the transit, and I turned and walked out of the room past Vethers, who did not move but whose sideways eyes tracked me as I passed down the corridor that was cool and amber and pulsing slowly. Overhead, I found the nearest bench, equivalent a support bar along the corridor wall intended for Xyrath to rest a limb against, and I put my back against the wall next to it because my legs had decided that now was an appropriate time to remind me that I had spent 12 minutes on the floor of the Grand Assembly Hall, bracing the weight of a creature that outmassed me by several hundred kg. I stood there for about a minute just breathing. Then I took out my notebook and wrote down everything start to finish as accurately as I could remember it. And then, because I was still myself and there were still things I did not know, and not knowing them still bothered me the way it always had, I turned to a new page and wrote at the top, anomalous chromatophore wave pattern during formal address post recovery, possible communicative or emotional function. Investigate. The corridor was quiet. The bioluminescent panel above me pulsed at its steady, slightly too slow to be human rate. I would be here for the determination, 3 to 5 days, and then whatever happened I would find out. What came next, I thought that was probably enough to be going on with. The determination took 4 days, 4 days of routine meals at the human mission canteen, 2 floors below the royal quarters and 3 turns down a corridor that smelled faintly of something like wet stone. Evenings in my bunk with the reading light and the notebook and a new list of papers I had identified through the Royal Archive. Cross-reference that Sevik had quietly granted me access to on day 2 of the wait, a thing he had technically needed a supervisor's authorization to do and had done anyway without explanation, leaving the access code on a small piece of the translucent court paper folded under the food tray he had arranged to have sent to my quarters. I had been moved by that more than I expected. The papers were good, dense, technical, the kind of material that required a second read before the structure of the argument became clear. I read about Zith, lateral respiratory development, and the long-term effects of thermal environment on carapace formation. I read a comparative study of communication modalities across 3 insect species in the outer systems, including a section on Zith chromatograph patterns. That was the most thorough analysis I had found yet. I took detailed notes. The KE accusation moved through the compact dispute mechanism with the slow, grinding thoroughness of a process designed by committee. I was not directly involved in it. That was the mission coordinator's domain, and he handled it with the steady professionalism of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and understood that diplomatic disputes were not emergencies. They were whether you dressed for them and you waited them out. The KET had no evidence for deliberate destabilization because there was no deliberate destabilization. The accusation rested on the logic that the outcome benefited the human mission, and therefore the human mission must have engineered it, which was the kind of logic that felt airtight until you pushed on it and it came apart completely. The mission coordinator told me on day 3 that the accusation would likely be formally rejected within the week. He said it with a flatness that I recognized as a man not wanting to convey too much relief in case the relief turned out to be premature. The royal physicians contacted me on day 2. There were 3 of them senior by the marking patterns, which I was now better at reading than I had been even a week ago. They came to the meeting room in the human mission section, and they brought the paper, the actual printed version with annotations in the Zith pictographic script that covered almost every margin. They had been reading it with a thoroughness that I recognized as professional urgency, the thoroughness of people encountering material they should have known about and did not, and working through the implications of that gap. We spoke for 3 hours, or rather I answered questions for 3 hours while the physicians worked through the paper, section by section, asking me to clarify the researcher's methodology, explain the biochemical pathway analysis in the middle section that had the densest technical language, and describe exactly what I had observed in the Queen's chromatophores and limb rhythm in the period before the collapse. They were very precise questioners. I like that. Precision is something I understand. At the end of the 3 hours, the most senior physician, Dr. VTH, as close as the translation could render it, looked at me with the complete forward regard and said, "You observed the limb rhythm desynchronization before the chromatic recession?" "Yes," I said. "By approximately 45 minutes, none of our staff noted the limb pattern. You were not looking for it. We were not looking for it," she agreed. There was something in her voice that the translation did not smooth out, a quality that might have been embarrassment or might have been the professional acknowledgement of an oversight. Either way, it was honest. The Kathvari literature in the Zith academic archive is limited. The condition is very rare. It has not presented in this court in living memory. The Davi researcher's paper is not in the Zith academic archive, I said. It is in the General Compact Xenobiology repository. It requires access to a cross-species archive terminal, a pause, which most physicians do not regularly access. No, I said, most of the research we do stays within our own species archives. We do not often look sideways. Dr. VTH's antenna moved. The pattern I had come to associate with careful consideration of something uncomfortable. The human mission does not have access to the Zyreth Medical Archive. No, but you access the General Compact Repository. Yes, and Found a paper written by a Davi researcher about a condition specific to Zyra Queens. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. Then we would like to discuss the possibility of a formal xenobiological information exchange between the royal physicians and the human mission medical staff. She paused. Again, and with you specifically, if that is possible to arrange. I kept my expression neutral and professional, and I felt something warm move through my chest that had no clinical name and did not need one. I would be glad to discuss that, I said. On the morning of the fourth day, the official notification arrived. It was delivered by the senior court herald in person, which told me, before I even heard the content, that the determination was significant enough to warrant the formality. The herald read it aloud in Sir first, then in compact standard, which was the protocol for any official court decision that affected non-Zyra parties. The Administrative Council had reviewed the royal physician's report, the witness accounts from Vithers and Siak and 14 other individuals who had been in the Grand Assembly Hall, the medical outcome data, and the relevant protocols governing unauthorized contact with the sovereign. The council found that Sergeant Aller Vass had violated the physical proximity and contact protocols applicable to her position. The council also found that the violation had been committed in direct service of the sovereign's life and health under the invocation of the right of the known, and that the outcome had been demonstrably necessary and beneficial. The council therefore determined that no punitive action was appropriate and that the record of violation should be classified as a formal exception rather than a formal infraction. There was a second section to the determination. The Queen had additionally requested that the herald convey a formal designation. This was not standard practice in compact diplomatic relations. It was, the herald explained, an exceptional measure available only at the direct discretion of the sovereign. The designation was called, which translated approximately as one who carries knowledge of the court. It was a recognition of demonstrated knowledge depth that placed the designated individual in a different relational category, not equal to Zyreth court members, not quite a visitor, but something between the two, a being who had earned a place in the court's understanding of itself. The Keth ambassador, when this was communicated to him by the Compact Protocol Office, lodged a formal objection. The objection was noted. It was also quietly, entirely without the weight required to chain anything. I stood in the corridor outside the mission section and I thought about all of it, the 47 papers, the reading light, the notebook, the 4 download paper, the temperature, the hall on day 94, the 12 minutes on the floor, the holding room, the cool medical wing, and the Queen's voice through the translation pendant, and her chromatophores, the deep, steady gold of someone who was going to be all right. I thought about what it meant to be new somewhere. I thought about what you do when you are new somewhere and you have nothing to recommend you except the willingness to show up knowing as much as you possibly can. I pulled out my notebook. I turned to a new page. At the top I wrote begin second reading list. Then I wrote cross-species carapace, thermal properties, Zereth cordia, communication subpatterns, Deravi medical, archive access procedure. Then I stopped and thought for a moment and wrote one more line. Sevik asked about early Zith educational curriculum, chromatopher Development in juveniles paper topic. Potential. V. Thurs was at the corridor junction ahead of me. He had been assigned back to his normal post as of that morning, and we passed each other in the corridor at shift changed the way we had passed each other for 94 days. The nod, the sideways eye acknowledgement. The economy of two professionals who have established a working understanding. Today he stopped. He looked at me with all four sets of eyes, forward and lateral and upper, all oriented at once. I waited. Day 95, he said. Yes, I said. You will be reconfirmed to your posting. Yes, the coordinator has confirmed it. He held still for another moment. Among Zareth stillness of this kind, voluntary, deliberate, outside a ceremonial context, was communicative. I had learned that the content of the communication depended on what preceded it and what followed it, and what followed this one was, I read one of the papers on your list. I looked at him. You left the paper access code on the shared mission terminal. He said the General Compact Xenobiology Repository. I used it. I waited. There are many papers in the repository that are not in the Zith Academic Archive. He said I read 14 of them in the past 4 days. The way he said it was flat in his usual flat translated register, but underneath the flatness there was something not quite embarrassment, not quite urgency. The quality of someone who has discovered a blind spot and is deciding what to do about it. If you would share the remainder of your reading list. V. Thurs said, I would like to review it. I opened my notebook. I turned to the page where I had kept the original list. I tore it out carefully along the binding, folded it in half, and held it out to him. He took it with 2 of his 4 hands. He looked at it for a moment. There are 47 items, he said. Yes, some of them are Davi publications. Yes. Pelhari also. Yes. A pause. Then you read all of these before I arrived. I said, I have read considerably more since. Vas held the list and looked at it, and I watched him with the attention of someone who has spent 95 days learning to read a face that does not move the way human faces move. And I saw the thing I had seen in the physicians 3 days ago, the encounter with a gap you did not know was there, and the decision about what to do about it. I will begin today, he said, and folded the list and put it away and continued down the corridor to his post. I watched him go. Then I turned back toward my own corridor, notebook in hand, boots quiet on the polished floor. The bioluminescent panel above the junction pulsed in its slow, steady rhythm. Somewhere 2 floors down, the mission coordinator was managing a Keth formal objection with patient professionalism. Somewhere in the Royal Archive, Sevik was recording the events of the past 4 days in the elaborate pictographic script that no non-Zyra had fully learned to read. I thought I should learn that script, not because anyone required it, not because the posting demanded it, because I was here and it was here, and the distance between what I knew and what there was to know was still enormous and probably always would be, and that was not a problem. That was the whole point. That was what we were. I thought humans in the galaxy, not the strongest, not the oldest, not the most connected, just the ones who showed up with 47 papers read and a notebook full of observations that no one had asked for, standing in the right position on the right morning because the position had been chosen 94 days of careful mornings ago. The ones who looked sideways, the ones who found the 4 download paper I went back to my quarters and sat down under the reading light and opened the notebook to the new list, and I began.